There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Uh, so, chapter 11, Full Circle. It seems like the best title for this chapter because it indeed brings the book full circle to demonstrating what a synthesis of existing knowledge, social science that's out there, but that hasn't been cohered, to use Kenneth's term from several weeks back. But when it does, it tells such an alternate history, but a very reasonable history of the of Turtle Island. I and so it really is they show us how the dawn of everything can come together as a method, as there is a narrative there, but it's a narrative that operates at just a much larger scale and doesn't assume any sort of inevitability or ontological assumption about evolution, about progress, movement of time, or social organization. And so this is their like monograph, I guess, their 50-page contribution to writing this new history that we can now leave the infancy of our humanity behind and begin to write. And so I was trying to think earlier today, it's the book is the story of the story about a myth that once they tell the history of that myth, they can then go back and tell this new history that's only beginning to be written. And so this chapter, I mean, I want everyone to read the book, but this chapter alone, I think, for historians of global history, it offers something that completely forces pretty much every social scientist out there to rethink some of the assumptions that they've started from, and that even the social sciences have are products of evolutionary thinking. So, I'm curious to see. I mean, this chapter alone, I think, in the hands of just people who think they know the history of the quote modern period. Most people would assume the 1300s to be the modern period, and this is a contribution that goes up that far in the telling of the history of the Confederation. So every page just challenges me to think in a way where you are constructing epistemologies based on evidence, but where you're aware of the sort of framework itself. And so it's an ethnography, but it's an ethnography that's relying on accounts that only now can, I think, fully be used ethnographically, because well, as the authors say, the blinkers have been removed. So this, I don't, I'm thinking back to the critique that David Bell made, um, where he wrote as a historian of the Enlightenment and said that they got it wrong. And I do wonder if he read the entire book, because this makes a pretty good case for needing to rethink these ideas that have assumed to be written in a vacuum. This European vacuum. So I want this chapter in particular to to get in the hands of as many teachers of history at any level, because it fundamentally forces us to rethink not only the meta narrative of modernity, but the very idea of a time scale. Because I am someone who's been teaching history for like 25 years or something, and I maybe some of this archaeological evidence didn't exist when I was first trained, but that's no excuse. Like, this is material that uh, uh, that forces us to rethink these categories that are assumed to be European categories, um, where even someone who's aware of their own implicit bias to succumb to Occidentalism still isn't going far enough in the analysis, because they're only recognizing the Eurocentrism of it, which is still sort of an idea that assumes Eurocentrism evolved in a vacuum that didn't reference these ideas. So, yeah, I mean, this is a book for everyone. It's just hard. It's hard to get through because it's so big. So there is one sort of idea that I wanted to just um, toss out as a question, and that is, so by this point, the authors have dispensed with the idea of historical evolution, and uh, the idea that history had to proceed in an inevitable way. And so I do wonder what then isn't inevitable, because the history they present of the Mississippi and Ohio regions of Turtle Island is one where there is creative destruction. And so, is creative destruction then an inevitable facet of human existence? I don't know if the authors are saying yes, but once they write this history that is free of the blinkers, it does tell a story of of creative destruction and um, imperial overreach, not necessarily the inevitability of empires, but at least a process of overreach. And so it reminds me of creative refusal as, or culture as a cascading series of creative refusals and appropriation or borrowings. Um, and so, the dialectic that's at the bottom of that, I find just very fascinating. Would love thoughts. It's really nice seeing all of you. These are um, times when I I just wonder what sorts of insights David would be sharing. Uh, so I'd love to hear from folks. Hey, Michael.
Yeah, so yeah, Steve, I'd love to hear you do like an actual kind of bit by bit of the chapter itself, because I know, because you've kind of assumed we've all got it read, and I kind of know the overall framework, because he does cover this a little bit in the Democracy Project. Literally, he talks about this case. So I've read it before, and then I looked at this chapter and I said, oh, that's what he's going to actually go into all the details. And I got as far as the collapse of the civilization, and haven't read the discussion about all of the stuff on Kenderock, and the idea of a creative refusal, that in the central, they do the history of this first kingdom, which was a central region of America, and these Hopewell sites, and existed, very early in the last 2 millennium, and all of the clan structures of North America emerged from that. People being able to travel all across the continent and have a relative, so to speak, that they could stay in their house with, because they were part of the Deer clan or the Bear clan or all that, even though people spoke very different languages. So somehow that all emerged from the Hopewell civilization, but the Hopewell civilization gradually solidifies into cities and starts to use maize and corn. So that idea of maize and corn features in, obviously, that they're arguing that the early evolutionists, so in the very first pages, they argue the early evolutionism was, we start with primitive society that's all cheerful and friendly, and then we move towards barbarians, and then we move towards agriculturalists, and that was sort of said, oh, well, that doesn't work. So then in the 1950s, they had a similar version of this evolutionism that was based on the specifics of the energy use and how efficient people are in their relationship to the land. So, and part of this was, again, repeated with the recent book by Scott, who's a kind of an anarchist geographer. And he says, against the grain, that the early civilizations, when they had grains, once that finally formed, they could use those grains as a amassing of money. You could feed soldiers, you could feed people. It was like a wealth that was extractable. And this again talks about the maize that came up from presumably from Mesoamerica, the Aztec kingdoms, and all the places where maize emerged as a thing. And they started growing maize, and that maize was also part of central. Well, I don't know whatever to say. That maize was part of centralizing kingdoms. There is a bunch of stuff about whether or not maize itself, like being species aware, that maize itself interacts with humans in a funny way, and maize chooses humans as well as humans choose maize. David Graeber has mentioned that in the final, because I have read the summary. David Graeber does mention that in the thing, and he doesn't take it very seriously. He's kind of against that. Interesting debate. But so this civilization happens, and it's very centralized. They are a warlike tribe group with elites that seem to be sports elites. Like, it's like we love football players in the UK and across the thing. It's as if your football player, like David Beckham, instead of being just an advertising star, suddenly becomes a warrior who then rules the country along with another bunch of football stars or whatnot. And then eventually the whole thing collapses in the central Mississippi, this kingdom. This image of the noble savage of North America is actually totally like, these are like kind of a sinister kingdom that we wouldn't really appreciate. We wouldn't want to live there. It was a ruling elite that controlled other people. When they had burials, they have these mass deaths where they kill lots of young women and bury them with the king, right? That's the kind of thing you're like, that doesn't really sound really like the noble savage that Rousseau talked about, right? And it's fairly unpleasant. And then they go on to say this whole thing collapsed, and a bunch of people thought, what a crap load of bad civilization that was. And by the time the Europeans are arriving, There's a whole Iroquois tribes and many other tribes who have escaped this idea of creative refusal. We'll leave, we will we'll do something different, we're going to create something new, and we refuse to be part of that whole thing. And they're all, the Iroquois tribes are all obsessed with constitutions and how you balance things and making sure. They're kind of terrified that that will happen again. Oh my goodness, it's bad. That will happen again. So I'd love to hear Steve or anyone else talk about this, what they thought about the second half of this, how the collapse of this civilization resulted in like the Osage village and all these other things, and what types of philosophies Kandarak might have heard in his youth and all of that. Because that's not necessarily, I mean, I kind of know the overall gist of it in the same way you skim read something and you think, but I haven't actually read all the details. So I'd love to hear anyone else's comments on that, and maybe Steve could comment on those sections. And then maybe when we get to discussion, we go back to some of the conversation right at the beginning when he outlines issues about historiography. How do you make decisions and stuff like, not how do you make decisions, how do you decide what does and doesn't happen in history if you're kind of making social theory, and you can't, he argues that almost that there's social history has to be by comparison to some other places, and then argues that our history has gotten big enough so that it's only one kingdom after the 15th century that is the entire world, and there's nothing to compare it to. That's a really dramatic statement in historiography. And it starts to ask, what's the point of the book saying things could be different if we're all one unit of control at this point? But I'll just stop there. If anyone wants to, and particularly Steve wants to like summarize the sort of second half of the chapter, some of the details in that, I would love to hear that.
I'm happy to defer to anyone if someone would like to jump in.
Well, I'll just say, for me, the Osage, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that example is just incredibly appropriate to the lead-in to the Five Nation Confederacy, etc. I mean, it's indicating so much the amount of time that must have gone into restructuring society, the complicated relations that were set in place to ensure that forces were balanced. There was sort of this alignment with their cosmology and their politics. And it just seems like such a beautiful example to delve into before we get to the origins. Well, I shouldn't say the origins, the foundations and culture of what Kandarak actually knew of in the background. And then I'd just like to point out one last thing. So, Michael, sorry, it's not detailed. It's more reactions, but it's just, to me, it's so mind-blowing. It's hard to stay on track. When in the last part, when they were talking about the Jigomesh, the woman chief that was last, the descendant of the Mother of Nations, I think. And she defeated the French.
What page is this?
It's pages 490. Do you have the English version or the American? It's the last couple of pages of that chapter. And I think it's going to be the last page, right before the last page of the chapter. Anyway, she had actually outdone a French general who was there to betray the indigenous people. And she had outdone him in battle. And then when she withdrew after that and was sort of reconstructing the society at that point, She demobilized her army. So this, the line goes from the penultimate page to the last page, and returned to the process of selecting new officials to reconstitute the Great Council. If she had chosen to act otherwise, however, precedents were available. And to me, that's like when we come back from chapter 2. So chapter 2, we know about Kandiaronk. Here, the layering underlying all the things that Kandiaronk had been exposed to is incredible. That says it right there in a sentence of how much time and debate went on for these various, configurations of society. I really love that we came back to the sort of the environment of Kandiaronk. And without the rest of the book, I mean, we have a real feel for, all the elements of domination and how they would, how they could fail or not fail. And there is one question I want to just leave with people. And so, Steve, sorry, I didn't mean to take away, but this idea of translating esoteric knowledge into bureaucracy seems to come up. And that seemed to be a failure on the part of people that were trying to achieve a state or a regime with all those three components. And it seemed like they were implying that it looked like trying to translate esoteric knowledge into, managerial science or something was a key factor. And if they couldn't do that, then they wouldn't be able to succeed.
Yeah, Mark, you used the expression mind blowing. And it, for me, it's an entirely new history in those pages that they're, that they're able to get to the 1640s around page 491, show how the specificity of decisions made by I don't know how to pronounce these names, and I've not like even practiced to pronounce them, so I'm not going to. But the how they're able to include questions about arrests of indigenous authorities having having an importance in a larger global history that is only right here for the first time really being written. And so it, before this book, I didn't know of Kandiaronk. At least I feel somewhat not too terrible about myself, because from what it sounds like, David Graeber didn't know many people who knew of Kandiaronk. So, it was sort of an eye-opening experience for him. And so I honestly didn't know that this level of ethnographic detail what was possible. So it's going to be tough for me to really to retell that history, because I didn't do a lot of highlighting, because every sentence was like that. I don't, what's happening here? I mean, I'm not kidding. Like, it was, I know nothing about the period between 1230 and 1375, other than like what was going on with regions south of present day Texas, you know, Mexico and below. And so but Michael, you do have the, I mean, as I understand them, you have the contours down, and that Kondiaronk was, it appears that Kondiaronk is aware of this history that has been buried, but that also the knowledges on which authoritarian rule was based were also destroyed, and the oral traditions were even not retold because of the power relations that they could convey. So it, and then how this ties into the ideas that Europeans will develop about notions of individual liberty. Yeah, one of the things that did, so since I don't know the sort of how to narrate that, the things that stood out to me were, and this is going to refer to some you know, other research that David did into just a cult ritual, and how the indigenous tradition worked on dream analysis as like path work and esoteric knowledge, and occult ritual, well, occult ritual as esoteric knowledge, and how those have gone together. And so even, you know, it even upturns our notions of Freud, because he can't really take credit for the dream analysis that he's been given credit for. You know, how that's going to fly in the academy, I don't know. Yeah, I had basically been taught this conventional wisdom that, you know, bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states. And it for me, professionally, it's kind of weird because, you know, by day I teach history. And as I've been reading this book and doing this reading group, I've had to wrestle in a fundamental way with how I teach. How I teach history, because not only is my understanding of the narrative now being completely disrupted, but my understanding of how what constitutes an epistemology, you know, how we make sense of the limits of what we can know. And it's made every day actually kind of difficult, because the students have not read this book. They're not familiar with its arguments, and so to unleash it without preparation is you know, it's just going to fall flat. And yet it's on a daily basis challenging me in like fundamental ways, where I'm spending time trying to explain, trying to work out how to make sense of this in real time as I go about, you know, doing a job being paid to like teach global history, which, you know, has never been global, clearly, even though that's what I get paid to do. Good job. There's Mona, I would love to hear from
Hi. I always had an issue with history because I'm basically a philosopher, a theoretical person, and I was really upset with the idea that you cannot make history with the what if. And I said, if you can't make hypotheses, and if you cannot ask yourself, what if things had gone in another way, you cannot make sense of what happened. And actually, the way we make history is theoretical, nonetheless, without being aware of it. And the result is that what happened appears as inevitable. Making history, making sense of what happens, means to prove how it couldn't have gone in another way. So Candia Rock and American experience are essential. The authors explain very well it in the chapter, because not being connected with the Eurasian and even Oceanian civilization, they took a totally different way. So they are the best proxy to what if things had gone in another way. And this applies exactly to the question with they opened the chapter. Okay, things may have been different in many millennia ago, but in the last 2,000 years, we only witness hierarchies and states and war and violence. So how can you prove that it is not inevitable just on the long run? You prove it through the American experience that took a totally different path, because I think because they had no money. I think the peculiar feature of Eurasian and Oceanian civilization is debt and money and exchanges mediated by an abstraction. And well, and what we see in this other world that wasn't a new world, wasn't savage, wasn't a state of nature as the European read it, but was another possible path of civilization. Is what we see there is that hierarchy is not inevitable, that dimension doesn't imply complexity, and that complexity doesn't imply hierarchy, and that agriculture doesn't imply complexity and hierarchy. And also, I'm not sure, and we also see in this civilization that constantly rediscussing social arrangements can be totally normal, and how they did it. And I will read something I highlighted. As we said before, there are certain freedoms to move, to disobey, to rearrange social ties that tend to be taken for granted by anyone who has not been specifically trained into obedience, as anyone reading this book, for instance, is likely to have been.
What
So
page
there is
number is that?
it's a full circle, page 482 in my edition. That is the English one. And so I got lost.
I just,
Well-
while you're, I'll flag out that some of the page numbers of the other stuff that Simona was bringing up, the issue of the historiography that Simona raises, which is all the stuff out at the beginning I thought was great, was 449 on the English edition. And I thought you flagged out, which I thought was amazing, was but I don't know what it means really, but David Graeber obviously has a specific theory about the form of exchange, like the relationship between slavery and coinage, and another one, and that's all on page 450, but it's not really discussed that much in this. And then I guess Simona was also talking about the bands and the evolutionary framework, which is also on page 447 and all that, but that's really the whole chapter is on that. So you would have hard pressed to read the chapter with missing that.
Just one last thing. At the very beginning of the chapter, I find it very interesting, the critical note about postmodernism and the idea that, and how is it, how much it is important to cross between disciplines, and the hyper specialization of postmodernism makes it so that everybody takes for granted assumptions coming from other disciplines that that are simply false, as they prove through the book. And something that strikes me is how any individual point of the book, and also of other David's books, is something that is taken for granted in individual disciplines. I don't know if I mentioned here the reaction of my husband, who is an economist, to the issue of the myth of barter. He said, but nobody believes in this myth. Why do David takes so much effort to disprove something nobody believes in? And this was the same reaction I had towards chapter 10, because nobody in political philosophy environment believes that state is something we had in ancient Egypt. But it's when you cross over disciplines that you can see the what does it imply to forget about these myths. Sorry for taking so much time. But if nobody wants to jump in, I can speak until tomorrow morning.
I always learn so much when I listen to you, Simona. So actually, I'd be okay with that.
Yes, but for me, for example, will be much easier if we will move slow steps, because as Steven was saying in the beginning, this book itself, and we are just a little bit jumping from one to another, so it's also difficult to comment on that. Yeah, I would just start from the beginning and ask this question about how we lost this freedom of the freedom to be able to withdraw and to leave, and how all the structure of different civilizations was built on that. So even if you have this bureaucratic civilization, you always have somebody living on the margins with their own rules. And yeah, and so that's interesting how it's correlate to the world as we live in now, especially in the in what's going on right now, when the world are kind of cracking down on two big different parts that didn't happen for the last 30 years. This is a long time for the human lifespan. It's short. I don't know if somebody will explain that. Maybe I will ask Simona. So.
I cannot guarantee that this is in chapter 11, but there is an idea of David's that is recurring in my mind in the last days. He said the state as a bureaucracy, heroic society, and which was the third feature? I don't remember now.
Charismatic,
charismatic and violence. The state, as we know it, is there's three features are falling apart, he said. And while we believe to be living in states, under states, we are living under global bureaucracy that is supplantant, that is taking the place of the states. So I was thinking of the blocking the Russian accounts outside Russia. And Michael Hudson wrote a very interesting article about it, about the way USA is able to make others pay for their debt, and about how there is a debate in Italy about it, about how the enlargement of NATO that led to this conflict is actually a move against Europe, a move against the starting of trade and of the multiplying connections between Europe and Russia and China. And Michael reads what's happening as an attempt to create two worlds, one on the side of the West, that is Europe and USA, and the other connecting Russia and China. I think this will be a boomerang, but what's interesting in this frame is that this war, just as policies during COVID, policies about vaccines during COVID, and just as the Emergency Act of Canada, are a bureaucratization of violence. It's not the state as we knew it, as a monopoly of force and as enforcing rules through violence or through the menace, the threat of violence. It is administrative
I think it's managerial feudalism.
yeah, it is. And it is also that you don't hit citizens through manganello by beating on their head, as David would say, but by blocking their bank accounts, as it happened in Canada with the Emergency Act. I think this this act, this Canadian act, is a really time-shifting event. It's a change in. It's an enormous change in politics, because in a sense it's biopolitics, because what was violence becomes administration.
But isn't it always so? Any of this administration violence always back up by real violence? And without that. So in this case, it's maybe hidden, it's maybe a couple steps away, but we all know that, you know, they block your bank account. If you don't pay, you just go to prison. That is real violence, you know, that's physical violence already. So in this case, I think this not a so big difference between just sovereignty when the ruling people on certain territory have violence. But it was very interesting what you were talking about global bureaucracy, because interestingly enough, despite the fact that certain countries didn't recognize vaccine of each other and so on, but the whole world acted very unilaterally during COVID, and they were able to very quickly unfold really global system of control of movements, and it was no way, as in the beginning of this chapter was said, that it's always exist places where you can go away, like that didn't exist anymore. No way you can go away. You're always in the system. Could be like system could call differently a little bit, like Sputnik is worse than AstraZeneca, whichever, but overall it's the same rules.
Yeah.
So that's the world we live now looks like.
Yeah.
Michael?
No.
Yeah, just to comment on I guess I didn't quite understand like the relation of what Simona was saying about right now and those issues, or what Steve was saying about managerial feudalism per se, but just to like it obviously had something to do with it, because where Nika ended up with it on the issue of being able to escape as one of the freedoms, and how difficult that seems to be now. You know, seems this chapter, what Simona began with when she talked about the historiography, which was on page 449, and these two issues that he does in historiography. One is a very typical issue. This is a big issue in his historiography, and he deals with it very lightly, but that, you know, the idea that could it have been done otherwise? You know, history is this event, and he has some big statements on history, like it's not history unless it was something that happened once and it couldn't have been done otherwise. This is the kind of long debates that, you know, someone like Nietzsche that says history is about chance, or you know, something that you don't know, you made a choice and that's what happened, or a culture or people made a choice. Also in historiography, it's also important not to kind of justify the past based on what happened in the present, which is always, well, this is where we are now, so everything that happened in the past led up to now. So you have to go back to the past and tell the story of then as if you were there and you don't know what's going to happen, that what is happening next is completely uncertain, in which case you must be able to say, we're not certain about what will happen, that it could have been otherwise, which is an important point. Although once you get to the future, you know it wasn't necessarily otherwise. I would argue that we don't actually know exactly what happened in the past. And there is a sort of freedom about the past, which people need to have in order to tell their own story. You need to liberate your own ancestry from the squalid, terrible things. If all your ancestors were cattle thieves and you want to be able to tell a story about, well, we now are liberated, then you maybe need to tell it. But that's maybe a different issue. The other thing he says in this historiography moment is quite thing. The only thing we can do is compare, like to do a historical experiment, you have to have two situations. You have to say, it happened like this here, and it happened like this here. Are they both the same? And that comparison is an experiment. And if you could say every different type of city that evolved grain had this experience and not this other experience, well, he points out, well, a bunch of places that evolved grain got rid of it, which is actually what the guy Scott in Against the Grain says, that it's not certain that like having excess of food or these grains will lead to, you know, a doomed civilization, because, you know, once you have agriculture, you'll have food accumulating and someone will steal it and use it to control everybody else and pay their soldiers, right? So that's what he's making. In those little cases, you can do an experiment, but he is arguing quite damningly that at a certain moment from the 1500s, that it's only one story in all of history, that now the Europeans in somehow have made the only one story. You know, I wonder if that then like contradicts his arguments about scale. And it's not so much that if the scale gets too big that humans can't live, it's really that the overall scope, like the planet is one size, the scale got bigger. If we had a planet the size of Jupiter and people could continue to move away, we still haven't circumnavigated the globe, maybe even now we would still see new histories emerging. So this kind of claim that at 1500, the Europeans now become the one story that is circulating the globe. And here we have Nika saying that no one can escape. Although lots of Ukrainians are crossing the border right now to escape a dictatorship, but they still, where is it that I go to escape capitalism, you know? And so I wonder if the whole argument of scale is an interesting one, not so much that if we could get bigger and escape, that's great, but actually the planet was one size. And it wasn't so much that the scale got bigger, but the world got smaller. I'm just throwing out these ideas in terms of debating what because like a lot of this book is super cheerful, like, look, it could have been otherwise, and it was otherwise. There are all these civilizations that were completely escaped hierarchy or patriarchy. And it's not a gradual historical progression. It's actually about whether you choose slavery over other people or whatnot. And many civilizations who had chosen slavery collapsed as people unchose it, escaped and made a new thing, right? And I'm wondering, is there still an escape? And what can we say about the collapse of our civilization? Does the world become smaller when you're not threatening each other with swords, you're threatening each other with nuclear weapons, right? Those are the kinds of questions that I would, you know, ask of this book, The Challenge, because it's amazing to me that everybody reads this book and is cheerful, because it goes back and actually shows lots of horrible events in prehistory. If Rousseau had said everything before, you know, 1500 in North America was the noble savage, and they were all just friends with each other in happy tribal bands, and they go back and unearth a a hidden civilization named Cahokia, that wasn't its name. That's just the leftover name for what this place was. And it was actually pretty nasty. And when they buried people, they killed like 100 young women to bury with the king and things like that. So some of it's like quite depressing, but what the great thing is, we're not trapped in a history that is inevitably bad. So the question, of course, is in the last 2,000 years, this progressively expansion of kingdoms and states led to a place where you can't escape? And is that an issue of the world getting smaller, an issue of scale argument, or what would we say about that? Or is it just like, it's a bit of a short period of time, 2,000 years, human beings have been around for hundreds of thousand years. This is just going to get wrapped up, and whoever crawls out of the bunkers in the next nuclear war will set up small bands that are quite nice, or big civilizations that are quite nice, and they actively work not to have patriarchy and nuclear weapons.
Ellen?
Right, I think these are great questions, and I think raising the question of scale, I think, is really helpful, but maybe we could also think about it in terms of the scale of connection rather than just the size of a society or whatever. So I think that what we've had from the 15th century that he's arguing for, or they're arguing for, is global connection. So we don't have a situation in which we're not going to be influenced by anybody. But it seems to me that if what we require is not to be influenced, then that's, in order to do something different, then I'm not sure that's doing something different. It's being trapped in something smaller. So what I think that we get is a much wider range of connection. But some of what they're showing also is that in smaller scale societies, they were all connected with their neighbors anyway. In fact, much more connected than we tend to think they were. So I think what happens is that we have a much wider range of connection. And the thing that is different now is it's not that we're all the same, because we aren't. So the place for hope now, I think, is that if some radically different choices may have disappeared with the people who hosted them, new things are appearing all the time. And I think that just because something is lost doesn't mean we can't gain anything. So I think that if we look around the world, we are constantly doing all kinds of things that had never happened before. And so I think that even if we're all connected, it doesn't mean that we're all the same or that we have to be. Does that make sense? I think there isn't anything that stops us from creating new things just because we're connected. Or it doesn't have to be. That's my 2 cents. I think there's somebody else who has a hand.
Yeah. Thank you, Ellen. Syed?
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I've been thinking about these grand narratives that Michael talked about. And I think the era of globalization that began about 400 or 500 years ago, it set a precedent of these grand narratives that encompass everyone, because we were suddenly connected to everyone. Like Ellen mentioned too, like we aren't the same. Like indigenous civilizations weren't same as Eurasian civilizations or Africans, but we suddenly were more aware of the other people's existence, and the dominant European narrative started to build this umbrella that encompassed all of humanity at that point. And it basically got refined and kind of seeped down to all people's consciousness. That doesn't mean that we can obviously create alternative narratives. It's just that there is some universality now that didn't exist. And now we're conscious about other people. And to a much higher extent, like a hyper consciousness about all of the global events, and even like alternative histories too. So I think what I'm trying to say is, because we're conscious about other societies and other samples of hierarchies and other, like in our own history or even other civilizations' histories or other societies' histories, we can proactively and consciously choose other paths. And that we have to see what's in our interest collectively, individually, and see how that aligns with other communities and individuals, and find what's mutually beneficial. So in that, for example, this idea that we were talking about, I think Simona mentioned that, you know, how there's these power blocks forming now that after the sanctions that are imposed on Ukraine, obviously it is triggering certain reactions in certain countries that if Russia could be subjected to these sanctions, why not? Like it's a threat to what China could be subjected to if they react to Taiwan or the Uyghur situation. India itself is building a narrative on its own that which side it decides to choose, whether it decides to, you know, withdraw from weapons purchases from Russia or proceed in that direction. So the civilizational interests are at odds, where the West is on one end and then maybe the developing world is on the other end, which still has things to gain. But an alternative situation, an alternative example would be the COVID situation, the vaccine thing that Nika mentioned, that in that scenario, the interests, the collective interests were overlapping for all societies and countries. So that's why there was much more of an incentive to work together to enforce policies and regulations and hierarchies, essentially, which everyone could agree upon and everyone can implement, apart from those people that, you know, didn't want to get vaccines, or they thought their bodily autonomy was being violated. But I'm just giving these examples where it's basically all about interests, where in some situations where interests are at odds and some people have to gain something and others don't, the narratives collide. But there are alternatives where narratives kind of become universal, and there's enough of an overlap and accumulation of masses where they can agree upon that, say, this is something that we can like set a baseline on and everyone can agree, like in the case of vaccinations and like the COVID response, because everyone's interest was basically to get over this hump together. So as our experiences become more universal in terms of climate change, global inequality, I think bureaucracy will also evolve to as a response to address those things, because, you know, tax havens and pandemics can't be addressed locally anymore, and there has to be an institution, which I guess I am aware that it's the ultimate bureaucracy could be the ultimate form of domination, but it might naturally come through as a reaction to all of these issues that are essentially global in nature. So that's what I have to say.
Nika?
Yeah, I will try to be short. So I just really like this idea of narrative and how it's developed. And I'm reading Pirates now and working on the Pirates book. So it's interesting that if in 15th century Europeans developed this grand narrative and basically make the whole humanity live in this one framework, then the pirates is the guys who challenge that. Also kind of military because they were like fighting empire, literally, but most of all by creating a new narrative and creating these autonomous zones. So, and looks like this current world will be covered by these major powers that only you can confront them is in the same way as to create these autonomous zones with the alternative stories. Yeah, and that's the only way to go, looks like, for now.
Yeah, Simona, I'll pass to you in a moment. I just want to, what Nika said reminds me of a section in the introduction where they basically say that the best we can really hope for is to find some place in the cracks of this global bureaucracy structure of violence where we can either, hide the best with like-minded people, but to however diminish the weight of the jackboot on our neck, I think was how they phrased it. That's the best we can hope for, at least according to the introduction. Simona.
Okay. Well, we beat this global bureaucracy once, as David stressed many times. This thing, we beat the International Monetary Fund, and it's in the interest of the power to let us forget our victories. And it is important for us to remember that this is possible. This is never a never-ending fight, but victories are possible. But I wanted to discuss the idea of globalization. What's interesting, and it's very much stressed in this chapter, what's interesting in this book is that idea that globalization is not new. Actually, the reason why the Americas were a new world, another world, is exactly that they were outside the ancient globalization. There are movements of history that happen almost together in the axial age, that are like a domino effect, something that spreads itself. And this is something we can see even in our days. There are plenty of revolts of and of fights all over the world. Actually, I think that Europe and maybe the USA are the only places where revolts are not happening. And one thing that pirates show is that as soon as you remove violence and top-down control, people start self-organizing and and inventing possible ways to live together. And the conflict is inherent in this self-organization. It's a continuous debate and new inventions. And what they describe at the end of the chapter about I can share the I took a picture of the page I'm referring to. But what's interesting is that the continuous discussion and conflicts in self-organization. And one last thing, then I'll share the page. Pandemics can't be addressed locally, totally true. But let us see what happened with states dealing with pandemics. I don't know where you live, Syed, but in Italy, in Europe, and particularly in Italy, it was a disaster, and the result of globalization was that rich countries got all the vaccines. When Graeber tells it every day, it is not something that you can deal with by having just Europeans vaccinated, because new variants will. And COVID was the exemplar of something that happens at a world level and that you cannot address but at a global level. Global governance is a gigantic failure in tackling it, just as it is a gigantic failure in tackling the global warming. And instead, self-organization at a lower level would have led, for example, in taking better decisions about how to stop or slow the virus through the right choices at a local level. What happened in Italy, but I'm sure it happened all over the world, was that the authorities had to guarantee that people went to work, those working in
Healthcare.
no, not only in industry.
Manufacturing.
Those working in presence were the real essential workers, or not so much essentials, but essential for production, had to
Capital.
be in presence, and the authorities had to pretend they were doing something against the virus while getting these people at work. But okay, vaccines could have been produced and distributed at lower regional levels without nurturing big pharma. So there were so many decisions that could have been more efficient and more useful for actual people if they had been taken at a local or federated level. And I think the most important what if that we can ask ourselves is what if there is no authority, no oligarchy at command? What would happen if in a different situation? And so let's not underestimate the power of self-organization and how it happens as soon as you get rid of oligarchy. So I'm just being optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples that Graeber has often pointed to is an example of that self-organization coming into being is in moments of emergency and crisis, hurricanes, earthquakes, and that that people self-organize in ways, in unprecedented ways during those moments. And so, equipped with the knowledge that we have, we will have a crisis. We're in a crisis right now. There's also the larger global crisis. I think it is inevitable that a crisis will come, and that out of it, self-organization will happen in unprecedented ways. Will there be enough people who know that the steps that then need to be taken are mechanisms need to be put in place to creatively refuse the sorts of formations that lead to oligarchy? You know, that will only play it out as we can. So I see that it's 23 minutes past the hour, so I want to be aware of the time, but if anyone wants to have a last thought, that's perfectly fine.
I just wanted to say, like, the point Simona made is very legitimate in that narrative has a lot of holes in it. If you really want to poke, and go under the narrative that things actually worked out, like so many of the vaccines that, like, I'm in Canada, and so many vaccines that were more or less hoarded by developed countries were at the cost of more deserving people, more desperate people. But because of the nature of big pharma and how the nature of this capitalist system organizes things, whoever has the money has worth, essentially, and those who don't, their lives are more dispensable. And how they say, like, I heard this phrase on a business podcast that if you want to vote, you could vote with your dollar by, like, supporting brands that you care for, or like have better values that resonate with you. But then a critique of that is that you can only vote if you have the dollars, and if you don't have the dollars, you don't get a vote. So there are valid critiques to the system, and I think the whole summary of this book, as I understand it, is and as Simona put it, like, there always has to be, we should ask what if alternatives can exist, and where we can think differently and reject ideas and social relations that aren't serving our individual and collective interest, and work towards hierarchy relationships, not necessarily hierarchies, that do further those goals we have.
Hey, Nika.
I just want to quickly ask Simona to share the link on the article of Michael Hudson, if she has it handy. And thank you, everyone. It was such a horrible time, such a pleasure to see everybody. Real relief.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I guess the game plan is 2 weeks from now, we'll do the conclusion. Yeah, this has been honestly exhausting in the best of ways, because it's making me just rethink the fundamental questions about what it means to be here on Earth in this moment. So take care, everyone, and see you next time. Thank you.
Stephen?